Dr. Alpheus Hunton, not as well known, but he had a long tradition. His family were slaves. Some of his ancestors escaped to Canada during slavery. They then, many of them re-entered the United States after the Civil War. His mother was a part of the Pan-African movement, Ida Hunton. In fact, she went to France during World War I to work in support of the black troops who fought with the U.S. in France in 1917, 1918. And they were treated horribly by the U.S. imperialists during this time period. And she actually went there to assist the troops. And of course, in 1919, she participated in the second Pan-African Congress that was organized by W.B. Du Bois. It coincided with the Paris Peace Conference. 1919, of course, was a year of uprising. We had the Egyptian Revolution in 1919. We had the so-called Red Summer here in the United States, where what they used to call race riots erupted in Chicago and other cities throughout the country. And there were revolts in the aftermath of World War I throughout the colonial world. The Council on African Affairs was formed in the late 1930s. They had a strong base here in New York City. It was closely allied with the Communist Party, USA. Dr. Alpheus Hunton at that time was a leading member of the CPUSA and a scholar. He had taught at Howard University. He had graduated from New York University. And they did a lot of pioneering work in support of the ANC and other liberation movements going all the way back to the 1930s and 1940s. In fact, it was in 1946, during the Rand Minor strike, they organized a meeting at Abyssinian Baptist Church uptown that drew thousands of people to come out, and they donated material aid to support the Rand Minor strike that took place in South Africa in the aftermath of World War II in 1946. Now, Nkrumah's date of birth is said to have been September the 21st of 1909, and if you read his autobiography, it's kind of interesting how he came to that conclusion. He was born in Nzima, located in the southwest part of Ghana. His home village was called Nkrofo. He was raised traditionally within the Nzima tradition, as well he was joined the Roman Catholic Church, largely to have access to Western education. Nkrumah attended Catholic schools and would later become a teacher. In later years, he would assist in the formation of a teachers association to improve conditions as well as handle grievances on the part of teachers. This is during the late 1920s we're talking about right now, in the early 1930s. His earliest nationalist sentiments were kindled through a man by the name of Kwagire Gray, an educator who had attended university in the United States. After hearing Gray at the Accra Teachers Training College, Nkrumah decided to seek higher education in the United States. I think he heard Gray around 1929. Gray died suddenly in the United States in 1929. Now, Nkrumah assisted in the formation of the Nzima Literature Society. This was his perhaps first introduction to literature, and became more politically conscious as a result of that. In his autobiography that was published in 1957, he says, and I quote, "It was through this work that I met a man by the name of S.R. Wood, who was then Secretary of the National Congress of British West Africa," which I talked about before. "This rare character first introduced me to politics." This is what Nkrumah said. "He knew more about Gold Coast political history than any other person I have ever met, and we had many long conversations together," unquote. Wood wrote Nkrumah a testimonial which assisted in getting him admitted to Lincoln University in 1935. Lincoln University, of course, was the first university built in the United States to educate slaves, African slaves. It was opened in 1854, even before slavery was ended. And Nkrumah was influenced by the nationalist newspaper known as the African Morning Post that was published in the Gold Coast for a short period of time. Edited by Nnamdi Azikiwe from Nigeria and I.T.A. Wallace Johnson of Sierra Leone. Azikiwe had studied in the United States at Howard University, and upon returning to Africa set up his own newspaper in the Gold Coast. Nnamdi Azikiwe had studied at Howard University and had also taught briefly in the United States. When the Abyssinian, as I mentioned before, was invaded by the Italians in 1935, the African Morning Post was shut down because they had wrote editorials in opposition to the invasion. Even though the Gold Coast was a British colony and Britain was supposed to be opposed to Italy and Italian fascism, they still felt threatened that you had Africans that were writing against the invasion of Abyssinia. So Azikiwe and Wallace were deported from the Gold Coast. Nkrumah set sail for the United States in 1935 after borrowing money for his passage through a relative living in Lagos, Nigeria. He arrived at Lincoln University almost penniless and worked his way through school, attaining 4 degrees over the next decade. This is how much he wanted to become educated. Lincoln was the first institution of higher education designed for Africans in the United States. The school was formed in 1854 by the Presbyterian Church. At Lincoln University, Nkrumah was active in the African Student Association, which he co-founded and established along with Ako Ajay and Jones Quarty, who were also 2 Ghanaian students that were here during the same time period. The African Interpreter was a newsletter of the African Students Association. He would also publish a series of articles on black history in the campus newspaper at Lincoln University. His academic Nkrumah obtained both bachelor's and master's degrees from Lincoln as well as the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. While in the United States, Nkrumah lived and worked among the African American people and took a keen interest in their social plight. When he wasn't on campus, he had to work in order to gain his tuition and his livelihood. And he often roomed with African American families. He would also, his academic qualifications were in the fields of economics, sociology, philosophy, and theology, interestingly enough. He would be certified as a theologian, which gave him a license really to travel extensively giving sermons and lectures in African American churches in the United States. So he was well known even during the 1930s and 1940s. He would also debate E. Franklin Frazier, a well-known African American sociologist who went to University of Chicago. He wrote a book called Black Bourgeoisie, and people may have seen that, came out in the late 50s, about the black middle class. But Nkrumah differed with E. Franklin Frazier over the question of the retention of African cultural traits in the United States. Nkrumah believed that African Americans were still very much connected with their ancestral traditions despite the experience of slavery in the United States. Now, I was able to discover 2 research articles written by Nkrumah which were published by the University of Pennsylvania's Educational Outlook Journal. The first article that came to my attention was entitled, quote, Primitive Education in West Africa, which was published in January of 1941 by the University of Pennsylvania's College of Education. And Nkrumah begins this article citing Professor Arthur J. Jones' Principle of Guidance. It says, in regard to education, it is to prepare the individual for efficient participation in the activities of life. In other words, education should lead the individual into the highest, fullest, and most fruitful relationship with the culture and ideals of the society in which he finds himself, thereby fitting him for the struggle of life, unquote. That was written by Nkrumah in January of 1941, at least published then. Another article was published in November of 1943, right in the middle of the Second World War. It was also published in Educational Outlook, the journal of the College of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. This article takes on a much more political character. The article is entitled Education and Nationalism in Africa. And Nkrumah states in this article that, quote, human history has been dominated by 2 things, the quest for bread and the quest for human rights. Today we hear the deep, strong voice of Africa in the quest for human rights, unquote. Towards the end of the article, Nkrumah reveals his anti-imperialist consciousness by stressing that, quote, many of us fail to understand that a war cannot be waged for democracy which has as its goal a return to imperialism. It is our warning that if after victory imperialism and colonialism should be restored, we will be sowing the seed not only for another war, but for the greatest revolution the world has ever seen, unquote.